am the god of hellfire, and I bring you fire!
We're back, and sensitively as I can put this, that's probably more than Jesus could actually say right now. We are back, though, and in a very interesting time. This is going to be the first podcast with a new president over in the US, and that's been quite a time watching that from a UK point of view. We are on our part 2 of our season of hell. And just one thing I just need to say, I have got a bit of a throat issue today, so that might make me speak less and a bit slower. Thank God, some people might be saying out there. No. Yeah, that's right. This happens to be one of my subjects that I really do know about, so I thoroughly enjoy talking on this one. And so we're going to get right into this second part of hell, the deeper level. And Ed, could you give us an outline of what we did last time?
Yeah, sure. So we started talking about it sort of on the emotional aspect of it, but then pretty quickly we got telling the story of how firstly the Hebrews considered the afterlife and hell, and then you carried a story through, and we got through to Jesus' teaching on it, which is absolutely the kind of pivotal part of the Bible concerning hell. Yep. And which is mostly in the Matthew, Mark, Luke Gospels, but we also covered John's Gospel. And so that left us ready to launch into the very early church, the people like Paul and the Book of Revelation, which is what's coming up next. Just before we get into that, a bit of apologies. We didn't mention our dear friend Chris Date, who we interviewed back in episode 9, and hell was the thing he's sort of well known for and has put a lot of work into, and his Rethinking Hell kind of podcast and general ministry that he heads up. So that's episode 9, and so you get a lot more hell there if you're looking for it.
Yeah, it makes me think of thinking of that. It's like I remember back in the day thinking of these subjects that, it's like we're all sort of in a sense deciding what God is actually trying to say to us, and I can sort of almost imagine people going to heaven and then God saying, "Oh, so Chris Date, you're the one that's spreading all these false views about the judgment out there," or it could be
fake news.
Or it could have been the traditional person. That's right. You're spreading fake news about me. You made me to be a monster, and it's like, but we all have, God almost can't speak and we have to do it for him. That's what it feels like anyway. Francis, what did you make of last time, being more of an outsider on this?
Well, I suppose I've heard the arguments. I am more of an outsider, and I always think you're the experts. I've heard the arguments before, and I always come down thinking, this is pretty strong, because I grew up understanding that the Bible was crystal clear that if you were one of the goats, that was it. You were going to go to hell, and you were going to suffer for an eternity. I mean, I never really looked into it because it never seemed to me that it was a question about which there was any doubt. But once you know that this wasn't always the church teaching, that this was an idea that developed, then when you can go back to ground zero and look at all the arguments, then you can see the strength of the annihilationist position.
Yeah. Ed?
Well, I'm keen for you to launch straight into...
Oh, right, okay. It was just to sort of get...
next stage, yep. So yeah. What did Paul have to say?
Right, so, well, yes, because it's probably, as we've been going through in sequence, in trying to start from sort of Old Testament views, the immediate afterlife or not, then early attempts to look at, say, the end time sort of resurrection. What's really strange with uncovering Jesus, and then a little later we'll get into some of the theological terminology here, but if we're now moving on to Paul, it's actually striking that if you were to almost go back to what Francis you were just saying, if you were going to look at Paul, like give the book of the epistles, even the pseudo epistles, if you like, to all of them to somebody and say, right, find the traditional view of hell in these writings from Paul. What do you come up with? Well, you simply don't come up with it. It's just you can only come up with it by saying that Paul's language means the tradition, but you can't come up with it from Paul's language. And the point there to make is that Paul very clearly talks about destruction, perishing, those that are perishing, that sort of thing. He does mention a day of wrath, and he does mention there will be trouble and distress on a day of wrath. And that, again, doesn't connotate an endless day of wrath and trouble and distress. It's just a massive event, it seems to me, because in Romans, he says something like, just after that day of wrath and trouble and distress, he talks about immortality as a gift for believers. And he puts trouble and distress and death on one side, and he puts life and immortality and glory on the other. So the implication to me is that in the straightforward language, you have a day of judgment, wrath and distress, which sort of brings about death. So we're going to assume that the distress and trouble is an event which culminates. And that really is the position of Paul in its plain language. You have to then start doing some gymnastics, I think, to get further than that.
Right. What strikes me from this is, do you think there's evidence that Paul got that from Jesus, or that's what Jews thought at the time?
Well, it's. I mean, the thing is, in chronology, Paul's letters, particularly the genuine ones, say you're talking Romans or Galatians or whatever, you are the earliest back we can go. So the assumption often is with scholars is that Paul is imbibing the apocalypticism of Jesus, in which there is this imminent judgment day in that generation, and it involves destruction and perishing. So it seems to me that without bringing in this other doctrine called the immortality of the soul into the equation to sort of really mess it up, basically, it looks like they're in tune with the same kind of language. So there is this apocalyptic day that's going to arrive, and soon. And it's more clear in Paul that it's soon than it even is in Jesus, I think, in some respects, because there's so much of those comments. The time is short, he says. The day is at hand. I mean, this is quite amazing in Paul's language. So it looks like whatever he had in Romans about everyone coming to account in the day of wrath was a soon thing, at least in his view of his lifetime. And I think, yes, him and Jesus are in tune with language, definitely.
So I'm getting more that was what apocalypticism was in that time. Jesus picked up on it and Paul picked up on it, and so that's why they're pretty well in tune with each other.
That's right. And I think that the one thing that I didn't read much about when I was doing all that research years ago, I think Edward Fudge, in his great book, though, The Fire That Consumes, is probably the best 20th century book on the subject, but without doubt. But there are, I think, even better books in the 19th century, which no one mentions. But one of the themes is that the Old Testament sets the grounding. And I started off by saying this, removing the bad people from the land, letting the good live in it, generation after generation, in health and prosperity. The wicked have boils and sores and diseases, and then they are destroyed from the land. That's the theme that I think is picked up and almost put into the afterlife. But the same concepts are there. So Jesus picks up that, applies it a little bit deeper than just this life or just for Jews in Israel. It's now the whole world. It now seems to involve a resurrection, which it didn't before. So it's been pushed into the afterlife, but the theme is essentially the same, that ultimately the bad are gone, like in an incinerator, and the good remain. And that's really, I think it's very consistent through Jesus and Paul, apart from certain sayings from Paul and certain sayings, we'll get that on later. There are statements that look universalistic in both, which is really interesting. But we'll get there later.
Let's jump on to Revelation, and if you think any of the other letters and bits and pieces in the New Testament have anything to say.
Well, Revelation is very interesting because Revelation has become the grid. You know what I mentioned, that some people take a certain set of verses and then build their house on it. And all theologies do that. Biblical scholars try not to do that. They try to say, let's take each passage as it is. and even if it's contradictory, that's what a true biblical scholar will do. They will say, this doesn't seem to match with that. Fine, different writers, different authors, different meanings. But if you're a theologian, you tend to want to systematize and fit it all together in a harmony, because God gives a harmonious view. You can't have God schizophrenic. So the theology may make people take a certain set of verses. Revelation has 2 verses in it which sound like eternal torment. It's in the most highly symbolic book of the Bible, which everybody is all over the place trying to understand. It's amazing that those 2 verses have become the foundation of what became the traditional view of hell. And almost everything else, including twisting the word perish to mean not perish, consumed to mean not consumed, destroyed to mean not destroyed, all because 2 verses in the book of Revelation are its foundation, along with the verse that Francis mentioned last week, which Francis, I think you thought it said eternal torment, but it doesn't.
Yes, I was persuaded by
That's
your
right.
response.
It's eternal punishment is the word, which then can be ambiguous, fine. And we can talk a bit about that later. But basically, Revelation in 2 verses does sound like that, but also there's some very strong destruction, perishing, passing away, being no more language in Revelation as well. And so when somebody does understand apocalyptic language in extra stuff outside the Bible, you can actually get language that confounds, that almost like contradicts, but that's the nature of the book. There's one extra biblical text that says they will go away into eternal torment and then go into extinction. Now, how can you say that? Well, you can in these kind of books. It's extravagant language that is so hyperbolic and symbolic that you can do that. You know, you can say half the world is destroyed and then none of it is in the next chapter when you start again. It's like you cannot. This is not like law-like language, Francis, that you would have in a text of yours. You know, this is highly symbolic language, and then fundamentalists and conservatives have launched onto 2 passages and then built the edifice, I believe, for the entire traditional view.
What went on with the early church then, the next generation?
Well, that's very interesting, because in the initial early church fathers and comments, or even the earliest Christian books, nothing changes for a while. The language is the same. So you get Barnabas, for example, which was a book considered scripture and then wasn't considered scripture. It's fascinating to read that. That talks about a very interesting phrase in there. It says they will go away to I believe I'm right. It says eternal punishment with torment, which and then perishing and then dying and not being immortal. It's all in there, I believe, in Barnabas. And so the implication is that there is torment within a sort of a destructive death punishment, in which ends in not being anymore. And I think it seems to be quite clear in Barnabas. But what happens then is that you get that quite a lot in the early Christian writings before the church fathers, some of them late 1st century. They just repeat the language. Immortality is a gift, perishing, they die, or they do suffer torment, there's a day of judgment. You get that kind of language, but nothing more than Paul or Jesus would say, and not even as much as Jesus would say in one sense. It's only a bit later things start to change. The traditional view, what happened is that in the second, the universalism wasn't really around in the late second century, but eternal torment was, and universalism was more 4th century, possibly the end of the 3rd, and may have been a reaction to. They both believed in the eternity of the soul. So I better get back to this view actually to show what happened, because you've got in the early church fathers. The normal language of the Bible, you get to about Justin Martyr, which is about 180 or 160, and he starts to say some remarkable things that seem contradictory, but he still firmly talks about God only has immortality, which means he has an eternity. He doesn't die, he doesn't perish, he can't be destroyed, and that he firmly speaks that believers only get immortality. So he talks about death and perishing and torment for unbelievers quite a lot. He even says very strong passages like, in the conflagration of the end of on the day of judgment, all the wicked demons and angels will be destroyed and pass away. He says things like that, very conditionalist. But then he says some strange things like the bodies in the fire will be renewed continuously, as if you've got a destroyed person is then brought back and then destroyed, then brought back. So some people think there's an interpolation going on. And it's quite confusing language, but it's the first time you start to get some ambivalence. You then move on a little bit later to Tertullian, and he's like the villain for eternal conscious torment. Because you can trace it in his language. He's about 190, I believe, that Tertullian's around. Maybe is it early? Maybe it could be the early. No, I think it's the late 2nd century still. He has some Edward Fudge brings this up very powerfully. He says, Tertullian says, he takes the famous passage from Matthew 10:28. Don't fear them that can kill the body and can do no more, but fear him who can destroy body and soul in Gehenna. Remember that? Well, Tertullian takes that passage. Very interesting. He says, let no one think. This is really interesting. He says, let no one think. So he obviously thinks some people do think this. Let no one think that means an utter destruction of the substance so they don't exist anymore. No, he says, no. The soul is immortal and cannot, it's safe. He uses the words, it's safe from destruction. And he goes on to say, I think as Plato says, so he's starting to bring in the Greek understanding.
And is Tertullian a Greek rather than a Jew?
Well, he's getting he's not a Jew. He's getting the his influence from his Greek understanding and background, and he's basically wedding. So a lot of people do agree that there was a wedding of Aristotelian. I'm trying to say this properly. Aristotelian and Greek philosophical thought was being wed to Christian Jewish thought, and you then had that sort of implication. Now, by then, of course, you did start to have in Jewish thought a soul survival. So once you die, and it's not like the early Jewish view that you don't survive, there's a view that when you die, your spirit, soul, or personality continues. Well, some Jewish people were thinking this, even around Daniel's time before Jesus. So once you've got that in place, it's then one step further to say, actually, it never does die. And so Tertullian was saying destruction of soul and body in Gehenna by Jesus. He would be importing a Greek view of the soul that couldn't die, and also an eternal resurrection body, by the way, which is really horrific, and not many Christians point to this. But the idea is that you're raised with a body that cannot die, to join with your soul that cannot die or be destroyed, to go into a Gehenna that says you will be destroyed, but it doesn't mean that because you can't be destroyed. Okay, so this is what happened. And then as soon as you down the line, suddenly destruction means separation from God in agony forever, because you've got this wedding, you've got a wedding going on between Greek philosophical thought and Bible language. And so Tertullian it's argued that Tertullian is the first one to sort of blend the theology very clearly and even quote Plato. And I'm going from memory on this. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, can I just I'll chip in with what I hope isn't a red herring question. But would it not have been accepted by Tertullian that God, being omnipotent, could have destroyed the soul had he wanted to? I mean, was this seen as a kind of restriction on what God was capable of doing, that the soul was immortal and even if God had wanted to end the eternal torment, it was beyond his powers to do so?
Well, you raise a very good question. That did come up in theology a lot later with Augustine and other people who also took on even quoting Plato about the soul. But they were very clever. And again, Edward Fudge brings this up brilliantly in his book. Very clever it's like looking the other way depending on what subject you're talking about. So there's a sort of a view that was talked about that even the ardent traditionalist is actually a conditionalist in the sense you're talking about, Francis, i.e. God could do it, but he won't. Nobody went as far to say that God couldn't destroy the soul. And notice the language. Even they would say God could destroy the soul. And we've got Jesus saying that he will. I mean, it's really interesting that the very language that the people who argue for the eternity of the soul, they do believe themselves that if you said God could destroy it, you could say, well, what do you mean by destroy? And they said, well, make an end of, so it doesn't exist anymore. And that's the very view they're trying to not happen with the Bible language. Do you see the point I'm trying to make? It's a very twisted language. And yes, they do. Everybody believes in that kind of conditional immortality, that only God is eternal himself. He creates human beings and he could destroy and make an end of what he made. There's no question about that in all theologies down through history. But they look the other way. When it comes to hell, they speak as if it can't and that God's got nothing to do with it. It's just an eternal being. And then you have to add the resurrection, which is, of course, an action by God. We have perishable bodies right now. And in theology, we have perishable bodies because of what? Sin. But in the afterlife, you have imperishable bodies in hell. This is theology, and it's all happened. It's all happened because the theology has forced it. It's forced it to happen because Jesus said, "Don't fear them who can destroy body and soul." So both are involved in Gehenna, but both have to be eternal. So you have a forced immortal resurrection, which the Bible nowhere talks about for people in hell. And so this is the way that conditionalists really make their case. You hone right into this point to make the case that the Bible never did reflect this idea.
Okay,
I'm sticking to it.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Now, the kind of really, I don't know, fruity is maybe not the right word. The fruity language of Dante wasn't around, but it came in quite early. Was it this something of Peter?
Dante is really sourced from some of the ideas way back in the 2nd century document of Apocalypse of Peter, which goes crazy on the inner workings of hell and all this torment and all this suffering. And so it's really full of Greek, I think, eternal soul mixed with judgment, and it's all horrific, and it's very Dante-like, way before Dante.
Okay, so does the story pretty well bed down forever until your Victorian authors, or was there some...
No. So what happened with Tertullian and the immortality of the soul and Augustine in the 4th century really cemented that and Augustine is so clear. His one passage that says, and as Plato says, the soul is immortal. I mean, Augustine is so clear that the soul is an eternal thing, even under God's power, but it's still eternal under God's power and won't ever be revoked. That's the point Augustine was making. Then you had a response. There's some early people, slightly after Tertullian, that start to talk about the fire being purgative, and that because souls are immortal, they have to be, something has to happen to them. And if they are in the fire forever because they're eternal or coextensive with the fire, then that's one destiny. I think some Christians reacted to that quite strongly. And my understanding is that in reaction, they thought that they might be redeemed from the fire to enter the new heaven and the new earth. And that's when you get the whole language of the refiner's fire. We used to do it you'd have done it in your charismatic church, Ed, songs about the refiner's fire. Now, the concept of refiner's fire is fascinating. If you apply it to hell, that's what universalists did. The early universalists, and there was a number of them, what you may have been confused about with Bart Ehrman's book is that universalism was paramountly popular. The conditionalist view seemed to be just almost under the radar. So it's only argued that couple of church fathers held it, and they were quite mixed. The early language of the Bible is open because it just uses the language of the Bible, but that's what's being debated, the language of the Bible. What does it mean? So anybody can read back to the Bible their view because they believe the language means that. So what happened was that the universalists took on the immortality of the soul as well, but had a refiner's fire idea that you would go into. So did you, Francis, ever think that universalism was that just everyone was saved?
Yes, I still do. Until you're going to disillusion me.
That's right. That's right.
In the next few seconds.
That's right. I will. Sorry about this. Every week we have to deconstruct you, Francis. You know that.
You do. Yes, I'm still playing. I'm still playing Alan Davis to your QI.
I like that. That's right. I love it. Yeah, Alan Davis role. That's brilliant. I like it. Well, yes, because evangelical or Christian universalism is vastly different from some pluralistic thing that all religions lead to God. It's not so. Christian universalism used to have a different name, and it was called the reconciliation of all things, based on one verse in the Bible that talks about that. And they use that Bible verse to say, actually, God is in the business of reconciling all things, not everything other than the damned, but all things. And so that's kind of the last word, if you like. I think it's in Hebrews. It maybe not.
I've got it in front of me.
Oh, is it
I was
in Hebrews?
thinking of it. Well, the one I've got is Colossians 1:20.
Okay. There are a number
and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross.
That's right. So, and I remember being in university on this once, and I was sitting there as a conditionalist, by the way, by then, easily, because I mean, my journey was years ago, sitting in the class with the lecturer, and he was going through this stuff, and we were looking at universalism, and he read out at least, I would say, 10 passages. And I honestly was dumbfounded at the natural. We'll get into this. Yeah, that's right. I might as well do it right now. I was dumbfounded at the natural impression of everything he read. Having been so conditionalist, I wouldn't have thought I could be dumbfounded. I would have thought I'd say, but I just sat there and he read out these verses, and I thought, oh my gosh, it's obvious why some people believed in universalism. Even if you've got all of the conditionalist passages to deal with, you still have this either contradiction, or you just have this it's funny they should say that, or that, or that, or that, and make you think that God's in the business of redeeming everybody. And I was amazed, and it got the whole class talking, and they're all sort of fundamentalist evangelicals who were sort of like coughing and spluttering and not wanting to hear it, because universalism isn't been popular really in evangelicalism at all until recently, very recently. So the verse that you've got there, Ed, is one of them. And so what happened is the idea then is that the fire of hell, in a universalistic sense, reconciliation, is that there is a judgment, and there is the Christians that go to the same way that a conservative evangelical traditional view would be. It would, or even a conditionalist. It's like the saved go over here and the unsaved go there. The reconciliation of all things was the same, but it's that you went into the lake of fire, and there was a purgative punishment, not a destructive one, and therefore the purging eventually came, and you were purified, and then you eventually came out into the kingdom. And now you can see, what does that sound like to either of you, just by talking like that?
Well, it's a Catholic doctrine of purgatory. Absolutely, because these things got sort of mixed, like the intermediate state and the end, they all kind of get mixed up together. It's exactly like purgatory. The whole purgative idea is what was the original reconciliation of all things, except it wasn't this sort of, sort of lapsed Catholics that go through purging and then enter the kingdom. It's everybody at the end. So you could say, are you saved and are you lost? It's just that the lost ultimately join the saved through purging. And that's where the concept comes from. And therefore, they argue that not just the verse that Ed said, but, as in Adam all die, so in Christ all shall be made alive. That's just a second one. There's another one that says, when you sing in, what's the song, Ed? You sing in the charismatic thing, and it goes, oh, God, just trying to remember. I wish I'd got the universalistic verses in front of me now.
Can I help you?
Yeah. And it's one where he goes, everything submits to God or something, and all things you'll submit to the, if you confess, something about confession of everything.
Philippians 2.
Yes. What does
every
that say?
Knee shall bow.
Every knee shall bow. Now, you see, Paul says, whoever confesses that Jesus is Lord shall be saved. And it says, every knee shall bow and confess something like Jesus is Lord. I mean, when you read it as simply like that, you tend to think, oh my gosh, every knee that bows is saved, and of course people will pick it apart with all kinds of other things, and that's fine. But I'm just talking about the surface idea. It's no wonder some church fathers in the 3rd and 4th, 5th centuries believed in universal reconciliation, as they called it, including the devil, apparently, and the angels, with, I think one of the church fathers, Origen, I think it was, or Origen, believed that. It's argued.
And did universalism just sort of dribble on in the background? Or was it gone by the Middle Ages?
In certain, it was stamped out, yeah. What happened, it seems that there was some texts that actually speak that just like there was a point where the Trinity or the deity of Christ was like Athanasius was the sole last stand, and then everybody was an Arian. Some people spoke like that, and then Athanasius won out, and then Arians slowly dissipated and disappeared. It's the same thing. It seems like some people have quoted that universalism was very popular. That's probably what you've picked up from Bart Ehrman's book, because it was spoken about far more than the conditionalist view seemed to get lost and buried with a few church fathers. And it's argued that it's the first primitive view, but universalism takes the vocal stand. And it does seem to be that it was a highly vocal, prominent view within church fathers in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Augustine puts a stamp to that. And through his writings, he really battles universalism. He doesn't battle conditionalism because he's either not aware of it or it's just not a prominent thing. And so the idea is, yes, it looks like universalism is the sort of rival in terms of the language. It then gets made heresy at later things. I'm not sure. Chris Date knows all of the sequence of this point. I've forgotten now. But certain councils made it as heresy.
Doesn't really
Yeah, that's right. And then basically the Middle Ages, you've got eternal soul. This is where souls go straight to hell, straight to heaven, eternal suffering. I mean, it really was the dominant traditional mainline view until Anabaptists in the 16th century, surprisingly enough, they started to make some challenges. I've got things saying my internet is unstable, but it's back again. Okay. So
no, you were fine.
Yes, seeds in the 16th century with the Anabaptists were actually starting to challenge, because Anabaptists were looking back to the origins of the church, like adult baptism came from them, as opposed to the traditional infant baptism. They were looking back to the original scriptures, and it looks like they had some ideas about, death means death, perish, living forever means straightforward living forever, and none of this mix of immortality. But really, it was in the Protestant Reformation, which is really just after that time or at the same time, starts to have people start to be then conditionalist voices come out, and some universalist voices start to come out again.
Right.
By
so
the 19th
it's like a clean sweep. People read the New Testament without
the glasses. Yes.
Yes. And a lot of these
authority.
people presumably won't have been schooled in the church and sort of been told the correct line. They kind of come to it almost with a blank slate.
Exactly. It's a Protestant what's the word? A Protestant ethic. Ethos then, yeah, not ethic. It's like Protestant work ethic. The Protestant ethos would be that you would have the scriptures now. We don't want the church to interpret for us. So Catholics just believe in eternal conscious torment because that's what the church teaches from its tradition. And you didn't get many conditionalists or universalists. Well, you might get universalists from a liberal point of view, but you wouldn't get conditionalists from a biblical point of view, because Catholicism, the history of the church dictates what's true. That's why you can't get women ministry in the Catholic Church hardly at all, because it's just the tradition that women couldn't. It's the tradition that the soul is eternal and hell is eternal in that sense. But Protestants, no, they take the Bible, read it for themselves, and some of them go, "Oh my gosh, it doesn't look like the soul's immortal," and the fire consumes, and suddenly you did start to get pockets of people popping up. By the 19th century, it was all the rage with a debate between all three views, and that's when I first discovered the subject was a massive one in the 19th century, particularly.
Okay, so what's the landscape today?
Right. Well, the 19th century, I was surprised about this, because when I was looking at all this stuff, I thought the 19th century debates, they seem to have some people, it didn't seem to see them as heretics. Even a universalist was seen as somebody who just got it wrong. But when you got into the 20th century, something happened and it seemed to die out. And universalism and conditionalism just got knocked off the board. And it was back to, seems to me, the traditional versions of the traditional view. It'd be a lot more palatable by now. There wasn't so much worms and torture and demons and everything like that. It was much more, people started to talk of separation from God and alienation and thirsting after God, but you can't have him. All of that stuff was happening. But the idea of an annihilationism, no, and universalism, absolutely no. Heresies, rather than just an alternate view. That's what I discovered. And then something changed around about 1982, and that's when Edward Fudge brought out his book, and he started to go back and point out the 19th century, the early church light I've talked about. He even pointed to some bright lights in the 20th century. There were some voices in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. So there were people, but it was sort of like an underground movement. And remember, all the so-called Bible sects and cults did inherit the conditionalist view. Seventh-day Adventists were considered a cult then, Jehovah's Witnesses, Christadelphians. They all accepted that the soul wasn't immortal, and so it was guilt by association. Well, we can't believe in that because Christadelphians do, But it turns out that they inherited it from some Protestant conditionalists who were really making the case in the 19th century, and it just got through into those movements. and it shouldn't be a statement of what's true. Chris Date knows a lot more about this, by the way. And so suddenly someone, then John Stott, after that, about 6 years later, came out with it, and that caused a tidal wave of stuff in the church. I don't know if you ever heard about that big controversy.
No, tell us about it.
Well, and Ed, you didn't hear. Well,
Yeah,
basically,
I mean, yeah.
I
don't think we need to go too much really. So we've got lots to get through.
Some big names started coming out with it, basically.
Yeah.
First weight scholars after that, and suddenly people were coming out the closet almost, saying I'm an annihilationist or a universalist, as is now. People are saying.
And it's quite nice to look at this through the lens of the Unbelievable show, which is what we're all very keen on.
Yes.
And Justin has had all three views presented.
That's right.
Obviously by Chris Date a lot on the conditionalist view, and it's quite nice to put his name, Chris Date, in the search engine for your podcast feed, and you'll see about 3 or 4 he's been on talking about hell.
Yeah.
And there was a lovely one where a universalist was I think there was only one that I found them pushing for a universalist discussing with someone else. So it's all there, and so it shows that the debate is that most people, or the situation is, to me, is that most people still are traditional in their eternal conscious torment beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
There's a very strong, and they always win in the debates, to my mind anyway, ideas of conditionalism, with our Chris as leading the way, in Unbelievable anyway, and then a poor third is universalism.
That's right.
With, of course, what's he called? Love Wins.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. What is it? I know
Bell.
who you mean as well. Bell.
Rob Bell. Yeah.
Is it Rob Bell? Okay.
Yeah.
And
Rob Bell.
another one is Brian. Is it Brian McLaren, Christian writer? Unorthodox, generous orthodoxy. I think he goes down the same thing as Love Wins. Which is,
but that's considered a bit weird and wonderful.
It
by
is
the mainstream, whereas you can get more mainstream universalists who try to stick to
they do
evangelical exegesis.
They go back to the restorationists of the 3rd and 4th centuries and say, look, that was where we should have been going before it was clamped down as heresy. And they have their understanding of all of those verses in the Bible in their own way. It's really fascinating. Yeah.
So I'm keen to change gear, if that's okay. Now, Chris Date does these conferences, and he came to London about 2016-ish, and he did a conference in his Rethinking Hell series, and Andrew was there, and so was I, and I did a paper with Josh Parikh, who is someone who we have occasionally mentioned. He's a bright young, quite academic. I think he was at Oxford, and he did a paper that won a prize on suffering, I think, with the Tyndale people.
It was the problem of evil, was it?
Yes, that's right. Anyway, so he's sort of a bit of a friend. He's spoken at some of my discussion groups, and we together did a paper on the kind of apologetics angle with views of hell, and it was amazing how much we could agree on. About 98% of the paper, we all agree. Just occasionally we put in a bit where we said Ed and Josh don't agree on this point. And I will put a link to the paper in the show notes. But I just want to sort of talk about a few things that came up from it.
Certainly.
Of course, the main point when you come to apologetics and hell is people assume the eternal conscious torment, and Christianity gets a complete pasting. From the apologetics point of view, that, and we've discussed all this, and it hardly needs saying. I'll just give you a couple of quotes. One is something I read very recently on our Facebook, Unbelievable Facebook page by a chap called James Mason. I have no idea who he is. Anyway, he gave this nice little sentence. He said, "I have decided I'm going to love Jesus unconditionally, whether he sends me to hell or not."
Yes, that is putting the whole idea about loving Jesus under threat, or potentially under threat, in a nutshell. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, I see. It just shows how ridiculous. If you think Jesus loves us unconditionally, and we should sort of follow him, and it just makes the nonsense of all of that. If you're going to hold to this, well, actually, pretty well any version of hell, but the eternal conscious torment especially. I'll just throw in one quote that I have to thank Chris Date again for finding. So this is obviously fair ground for all the new atheists. They, Hitch especially, all laid in. But here's something from Sam Harris. He said in a debate. He said that the God of Christianity is cruel and unjust because he visits suffering upon innocent people in hell of a scope and scale that would embarrass the most ambitious psychopath.
Yeah.
So how, if you were a person who kept to the traditional view, what on earth would you do to sort of justify God in this way? And one way of looking at it is to say it's just a special case of the problem of evil. So in the same way that we're horrified at the idea that God could make a world with children dying of cancer that we're supposed to live in and he's supposed to be loving, this horror could be kind of put in the same category, and all the methods apologists use to justify God in the children dying of cancer case could be applied to hell. But actually it doesn't do that well if you go for that. So there's a couple of famous, they're called theodicies, of course, these sort of reasons theologians give for why God allows suffering. One is that giving us freedom implies that just the results in the fact that we suffer. So my daughter gets abducted and abused because of God so values the freedom of the perpetrator is one way of putting it. But then again, that doesn't, if you do go for that doesn't really help when it comes to hell. What freedom is being served when people suffer in hell? There's just no connection. So the freedom thing is just parked on the side. Suffering does us good. Well, if you're a universalist, I suppose you could say that, but any other version, it's final. This is the end of the game. So suffering for something for the future is out of the window because of this is the end game. And that's really why hell is such a difficult thing to justify, because of it is the end. It's final. You can't say, oh well, it is this way, but of course in the future it'll all be explained. You haven't got that because this is the final end. So now we come to skeptical theism. So I've spoken enough. Does someone want to pick up on what skeptical theism is?
That God has his reasons, and you can't know what his reasons are. I mean, is that too cruder explanation of it? That when we can never completely know God, and we can never completely understand his reasoning. So when we see something that looks inconsistent with God's goodness, it is more likely that it is consistent with our lack of complete knowledge of God's plan.
So that word plan suggests the future where something...
Yeah.
The current problem will be all... will show to have a value and a goodness in the future. So again, most of the skeptical theism that I've ever come across relies on the idea that there's a good outcome in the end.
I think that, perhaps you're going to come on to this, but I think that any defense of the suffering in hell has to rely on the idea that that suffering is an inherently good thing, that it's not something that requires to be explained in terms of an outcome. It is the outcome. It is the end. In the sense, I don't mean the end of final, in the sense of finality. It is the aim. It is its own aim.
So that means that we have to have an extreme version of skeptical theism where basically not just we don't understand God's plans, but we just don't understand anything. We don't understand what good means even. Because to us the idea... Yeah, sorry, Notice.
I don't know if I'd go along with that. I mean, I think that the defense of suffering in hell, I mean, I'm not agreeing with this, but this is how it has to be constructed, that it's to do with justice, that justice is inherently good, and justice is an end in itself, an aim in itself. It doesn't have to lead to some future outcome. Just doing justice is in itself a good thing. And by punishing bad people, you are doing justice. That is a retributive theory of punishment. And it's one which I think is, well, I don't want to get sidetracked, but it's actually one that I don't personally reject, although I do think that criticisms of hell as being beyond anything that you can justify are well made. You know, I don't see how eternal conscious punishment can be justice for anything that anybody's done.
Yeah, that a lot of Christians think that as well. Anyway, so that's quite standard to say. Well, I have a struggle with this because it seems to be an infinite a life of pain given by God or enabled by God, set up by God, all for your response of a very short response to something in this life, you know.
Well, I mean, what was the maximum you could sin? You know, you had at best 100 years in this life, you know, should we say about 10 of which you're not going to be held accountable for because you're a child, and generally the idea is that you can't blame a child. So you've got around 90 years. I mean, 90 years is peanuts compared to infinity, isn't it? For your 90 years, and that's even assuming that every single thing you did ever during that 90 years was sinful. So you've got infinity. You suffer for it.
A big thing for me is what's justice all about? To me, justice is for the sake of the victim. So you have someone who has been murdered or maimed for life, say, and the perpetrator, for the sake of the victim, needs to be punished. So if that's the case, what's God doing whacking the whole lot, except for the favoured few who believe in him? In hell, it's not serving any justice at all.
Well,
and if justice is actually because God's got pissed off with our attitude towards him, then he becomes this monster making us suffer and torture forever just because we've sort of done what's in our nature to reject him somehow.
John Stott brings up the point in his book that it's rather interesting how, you know, even in Old Testament forms of justice, you know, which is repeated in the New Testament, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, doesn't seem to correlate with eternal torment for 70 years of sin. Even that principle, an eye for a tooth. So even if it's a death for a death, or but it does get interesting in the Bible, because even Christians of the eternal torment sort don't like the idea of your grandmother and Hitler just suffering forever in the same way. That is kind of injustice, because you're talking two different lifestyles and the same response. And so a lot of those Christians try to talk about levels of eternal torment in some interesting way. The annihilationist does the same thing, that the idea is that you are measured, there's a measured amount of how much you languish in pain, as you die seems pretty. Objections would be this is pretty cruel as well, as if we wouldn't be like that today with the death penalty. We try to minimize any suffering, not extend it for a period based on how you've lived. But that's the conditionalist, one version of the conditionalist view as well.
Yeah. Chris Tate, with his Rethinking Hell, his quite a recent episode, 120, he lists in it the strategies that apologists use to justify God doing this eternal conscious torment style of hell. And he found three, and the first one is the one that we hear a lot, and Chris calls it air conditioning hell, which is quite liked. Basically, it's saying, it's just separation from God, and C.S. Lewis said the door to hell is locked on the inside. It's all kind of, metaphorical language for just basically is being parked separated from God is not going to be nice for you. William Lane Craig, he found a quote from him. He's saying it's like being left with your crabbed and selfish heart forever. That's all it is. This reminds me, do you remember Hassan Ridwan?
Yeah.
With us, talking about Islamic hell and metaphors and everything. Do you remember that?
Yes.
He struggled with it in Islam, didn't he? So,
yeah. But, so he said that, all this hell talk, maybe it's all just metaphor. But if it is a metaphor and it's all horrific, what's the reality that the metaphor is pointing to? It's not going to be something all sweetness and light.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, torment is torment, whether it's psychological or whether it's physical. It's still torment.
Yeah. And I used to get annoyed with this a lot, though, Ed, because when you're a sort of thoroughgoing conditionalist and you realize that the villain that started by Tertullian is the eternal soul that's put into the mix, this language means you like, as you said, you languish forever. Your heart is broken or you're feeling loss. It's a complete assumption that you have a being that's capable of lasting, and the idea that you can be in that condition is a pure theological assumption based on a couple of texts and a theology of eternal soul and body, and without that you don't have the ability to languish and last forever. So in a living sense, I mean, continuing to live. So when you remove annihilation, just has a field day with this kind of talk about hell, because it's like, just go back to the words of the Bible rather than your words of this sort of metaphorical C.S. Lewis stuff, because it's just trying to keep hold of the traditional view of the soul. Yeah,
of course.
Yeah.
Because Jesus teaches about the wailing and gnashing teeth and the agony and that's punishment and the fear. It's just not in keeping with just being parked in a room with your fellow atheists.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. So it's either an event that does end in universalism or annihilation, or it is an endless version of those statements. Thank goodness Jesus didn't say you will weep and gnash and teeth forever. I have to tell you, you read this, Ed, in Bart Ehrman's book. I heard this. You'll like this, Francis. I heard this before anyway, in another story, but apparently there was an ancient document that said, you'll like this. I really find this funny. Jesus was talking about the weeping and gnashing of teeth to the disciples, and they will throw into the darkness where they will weep and gnash their teeth. And they said, Lord, what if you don't have any teeth? And Jesus says, worry not, teeth shall be provided. And apparently it was an apocryphal thing that was made up by one of the lecturers back in the day in the 40s or something. But it sounded...
I've heard our wonderful Mark Goodacre talking about it. He did one of his NT pods just on that very thing. And he got it right back to Victorian times.
That's right. Oh, well, okay. That's funny because...
And Dave Allen did it. There's a wonderful Dave Allen version of it.
Whether it's Victorian times or a bit later, I got the understanding it was more in the 40s. But anyway, it's a fantastic thing. Raises a good question as well, doesn't it? About, well, what if you had no eyes? What if you had no living body, because how can you weep and gnash your teeth unless you can capable of weeping? There's a good question in that joke.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Okay. Now the other two are even less meritful, or whatever the word is. These are apologetic excuses for eternal conscious torment.
Yep.
There's apparently somebody called D.A. Carson. I don't know who he is.
Yeah, I've heard of him.
And he has his continuing sin thesis.
The problem is that like Paul even says things like you'll be brought to the judgment for the deeds done in the body. So it seems to be so much about what you do, all about what you do in this life is the sort of recompense of this day of judgment, is a response to how you've lived in this life. It doesn't seem to be anything other some oblique passages that say anything different. There's a verse in Revelation that talks about the people are outside the gates, and it's like they're sort of they're living outside the gates or whatever, and but then it talks about the nations coming into the gate, so it's all a bit weird. But some people use that and say, you see, they're continuing to rebel against God, and so God, to me, it's just a sort of philosophical justification, a bit like the atonement, where they say eternal torment is justified by God is eternal and he's upset, so it'll be eternal torment, and simple as that, really. Yeah. It's just philosophy. It's philosophy rather than biblically.
So if we're moving on to annihilationism, which we actually think is what the New Testament
we do.
Proper Christianity teaches,
we're fundamentally
things are better. For sure, they're better. The whole doctrine of hell is much less shocking and cruel and out of proportion. But still, I think there are some problems worth mentioning.
Definitely.
And one is this whole thing with justice again, that if you imagine some awful genocide and both the perpetrator of the genocide and the victim of the genocide will be suffering in hell together, unless, fortunately, one of them's a Christian. And that could just as well be the perpetrator who repents as the victim who repents. So even if there are people like that, still there will be cases of people destroyed in hell who together are on the one side a victim and the other side a perpetrator of the most horrendous evils.
Yeah. So
there's a lack of fairness there, a lack of parity. One feels. Yeah.
Yes. So this doesn't seem like justice.
Right. Yeah. So it's sort of like an Anne Frank will, even in a conditionalist sense, will end up being judged. There may be this horrible destruction process and experience, the same as Hitler. A conditionalist would probably come in and say something like I would have done, which is that I used to sort of use the grandmother Hitler scenario with conditionalism, as that it's not just an instant death penalty. It's like an experience of greater trouble and distress and weeping and gnashing of teeth in one case and lesser in the other, but they both do end up dead and not living anymore. So it's sort of like a more painful, less painful death. That's the only way I could see of some kind of difference between that destiny. But in your case, Ed, you're pointing out the fact that they both are not in the kingdom.
They both have an eternal reward denied them.
Yes. Yes.
So compared to that, their fate is pretty equivalent.
Yes. Yes. At the end of the day, it's leveled in the same way. Yeah. Good objection.
Can we say that annihilationism is just a consequence, or is it a punishment? That's
a very, very good question, where even conditionalists fall all over the place, disagreeing with each other. So you pick that up from I can explain that if you want, what the issue is there.
Good.
The issue there is that and Chris Date sort of falls on one side of this and others the other. It all comes down to a difference between the idea of what punishment is actually referring to. So if punishment is referring to a measure of torment, then it's argued that the death that follows because of it is kind of inconsequential. It's not the punishment. So the punishment is for a period, it's argued, for some conditionalists, and then they die. Whereas probably the most conditionalists say actually the punishment is to die. It's just the fact that it might be painful or not is part of the deal. And the argument that normally settles it, which I read in a 19th century book actually, was that if you look at Jesus' death on the cross, it's often argued, you don't normally say Jesus suffered for you on the cross. Some people do, but people say suffered and died. It's a very common combination of language. You don't just say he died painlessly, but neither do you say he didn't die. You just say he suffered and died. It's all one punishment on the cross. And that's the way that it's argued. So it is a punishment, but it involves pain. And but some annihilationists sort of see the suffering as the punishment and the death as a kind of a merciful release. And some see the death as the main punishment and the suffering is kind of added. So there is that. People have a lot of issues around that in the conditionalist camp. So that's how I would navigate.
Yeah. So if God is sort of mercifully parking us because we can't go with him,
yes,
then the kind of atheist death would be what you'd expect, which is that we die and that's that.
Yes.
But the New Testament doesn't teach that. It teaches that it's extreme. You get raised up again just for the purpose of suffering.
Yes.
Of something horrible.
Well,
and then,
or giving an account, and whatever that means. It's more like it's a court of judgment. You'd be interested in this, Francis, about in law. People often find that you if somebody kills themselves, like a gun spreer or something, and they kill themselves at the same time, people feel they've got off.
They feel cheated. They feel that justice has been denied.
That's right.
I agree. Yeah.
That's right. And so if though they're caught and they're held in detention and then they're gone to a thing and then they go through all the trials and everything else, and maybe they're remorseful, but they've got the death sentence on an electric chair. Or if you go back into medieval times, they'd be hung, drawn and quartered. People wouldn't feel they've got off. Do you see what I mean?
Blimey, not for you hung, drawn and quartered.
But you still, but you still die. I mean, nowadays it's electric chair, but you still die. So there's a big difference between sort of slipping away and feeling.
Yes. Yeah. No, I agree that. There is that sense of justice has not been done if the perpetrator killed themselves.
Yeah.
And the conditionalist view, to be honest with you, in its, I remember telling that to somebody, family member. And they thought a conditionalist view was actually pretty cruel. And they were eternal conscious torment person. It was a really interesting conversation. But the reason being was that he seemed to think that God just almost not thinking about the fact that God could destroy the soul. So it was sort of an inevitable outcome. Whereas he thought God is deliberately raising you up to put you through this period and then you die. And that was so cruel. And I thought, well, there's a fair point. We wouldn't quite think of it today doing this in our punishments. So I would agree with that objection. But that means it is a horrible destiny, though, because it does involve that experience of the day of judgment. So it's not light or laughable as some object to the conditionalists.
Okay, I want to move on because time's running out. So from our point of view, there is this massive problem now that if we go with the conditionalist view as the correct one, Christianity has got it awfully massively wrong for 1,500 years.
Absolutely.
And wait a minute, and how could this happen? This absolutely terrible view of God that's so off-putting.
Yep.
God has been quite happy to allow it to have arisen and remain unchecked and uncorrected, despite things like John 16:13. But when he, the Spirit of Truth, comes, he will guide you into all truth.
Well, Chris Tate told me it was ordained to be that way when I asked him.
Amazing.
Right, okay. Amazing.
Yeah. But that would be a minority view. So basically, it's just a massive cock-up.
Totally.
It's not, I don't think it's the idea that some conspiracy of theologians or something like that is ridiculous. People made a mistake.
Yeah, you've got yourself into I saw this when I came to the view as a Christian. It was like wonderful. So I didn't have to bear the burden of endless torment of everybody on the planet. At least there was a day of judgment and destruction and they would go. That's easier to mentally hold on to. But then I had to realize everything you just said, that this has actually been seen as heresy by some people. And you still get people today thinking it's heresy and that you're completely off track and you're not a real Christian sometimes. And so you're thinking, oh my gosh, so the view that makes probably the most sense to me is actually wrong, and therefore the tradition of this monster God is true, or you admit the massive cock up. Greek philosophy wrecked the church's doctrine of hell. And this is where we got to. This is what screwed me up a bit when I finally thought like that. I thought you can't have one without the other.
And the typical apologetic response to all this is that, it's just sinful humans getting things wrong. It's due to sin.
Oh, there's a big thing wrong, isn't
rebellion. But this is, I just think hearing you talking about it, Andrew. You maybe want to add to this that you were desperate to get it right. You were on your knees praying, God help me. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I've definitely. I thought that I had absolutely discovered truth, and at that particular point I was thinking this is amazing, and I thought, yes, all the error has gone wrong. But it did take me a while to hit. This means that the church got something so massively wrong, because eternal torment against annihilation it's an infinite difference in one way. Eternal death is very different from eternal life in pain. It was just infinitely different. And I thought, how can and then the gospel itself, the message of eternal life, means something so different for the one view than it does for the other, which means the whole gospel has been got wrong, which means the church has just screwed up its whole message from Jesus, what Jesus was trying to teach, which means, what does that say about truth? And so you're stuck. You're stuck. If you want to hold distant truth, you have to be a traditionalist. And then you might as well believe in adult baptism in that case as a Protestant, because that was the tradition as well.
Okay, so we need to wind this up really quickly before we have a special endnote. Josh, in this joint paper, he gave 3 responses to how it could be that doctrines could have kind of got changed and got wrong. 3 kind of benefits, I guess, or excuses or whatever. And so his 3 were, firstly, that there is a good in God leaving it to theologians to wrestle over these things and sort of solve the puzzle, as it were.
Right.
And the good is sort of in needing to seek God's help and all the rest of the thing. That was one idea. Second idea is the one we've covered. It's all our fault. It's our sin. And the third one is the kind of this chaos of uncertainty and everything helps us Christians in humility before God. So that those were the only things that we had in our paper that were trying to help on that point.
I think we don't find any of them particularly persuasive. Would that be right?
Yeah.
Okay. So the Christmas bells are sounding.
Yay. My favourite time of year.
We might have a COVID Christmas. We've no idea what will be ahead.
Right.
But Francis has some festive material for us.
Yes, I thought it would be interesting if we looked at a couple of Christmas myths or Christmas misinformation, put it that way.
Myth-information.
I think myth-information, indeed. I think we're all familiar with issues about the Christmas stories and the different genealogies and the different descriptions that they give of what Mary, Jesus and Joseph were supposed to have done, and how there are, well, should we put it as issues to be kind of explained and smoothed over to try and make one coherent whole of the stories. But I thought it would be interesting if we looked at a couple of other things which were just things that have arisen that are kind of mythical around the stories themselves. And I think perhaps the first one we'll look at is something that's a bit of a myth that's gained popularity in Christian circles. And an example I'd use of this was an article that appeared in Premier Christianity magazine, and it was written by David Inston Brewer. And I know we think well of David Inston Brewer, and he's, we recognise that he is one of the thoughtful and open Christians. But in his article, he doesn't spend a huge amount of time on it. He calls it Christmas scandals. And Ed, will you be able to put a link to the article in the show notes so people
Absolutely.
can see it? Yeah. Well, he just quite briefly says refers to this idea that because Jesus and the Holy Family were visited by shepherds, this was something that was really embarrassing for first century Jews. And I'll maybe just read this paragraph from near the beginning, where it's headed "Shepherds and Wise Men, Scumbags and Dodgy Foreigners." And he says, so why were the shepherds the best Luke could scrape together for his record of those giving an earthly welcome to the newborn Messiah? Matthew had fared even worse. He had to resort to admitting that Gentile astrologers, people who were despised by every pious Jew, were in attendance. If we displayed a nativity scene in a realistic modern setting, it would look very different from the cute tableau to which we have grown accustomed. Today, Jesus' visitors would be homeless drug addicts, those are the shepherds, and rich drug barons, the poorest and richest of the despised. So what he's saying is that there was this idea in the first century Judaism and first century Christianity that shepherds were pretty much the lowest of the lowest. He says scumbags. And when I read that article, I don't have any qualifications in this area, but my immediate thought was, well, this looks wrong to me. I mean, shepherds were the lowest of the low. What about, isn't there a bit in the Old Testament which says the Lord is my shepherd? I mean, is that supposed to be the Lord is my scumbag? He leads me down a dark alleyway to shoot up. I mean, I just thought this cannot be right. And so I did some looking around at this, and I found a site called, let me find it, Facts and Trends, discussing Christmas urban legends, shepherds as outcasts. Now, it's worth knowing about Facts and Trends that this is a Christian blog, and it's described as designed to help pastors and other Christian leaders navigate the issues and trends impacting the church. And they have reproduced a chapter from a book written by a professor called David Crotto, and I'm sure you'll be able to put a link to this article as well, Ed. Yep. He's professor of New Testament and Greek at Columbia University, and he is. I'm pretty convinced. I'm pretty confident I'm right about this. He is himself a Christian, so it's it's rather nice that we've got a Christian who is debunking the idea that has gained such popularity amongst Christians as criteria, arguing criterion of embarrassment. The fact that the New Testament describes shepherds being there means they must have been there because it was such an awful thing. So just very quickly skating through this, he says that this idea started... the first example he quotes goes back to 1893, and it's a scholar called Farrar who says shepherds at this time were a despised class. And then he goes through other examples, coming up to ending with Utley in 2004, who said the rabbis considered them, that shepherds, to be religious outcasts, and their testimony was not admissible in court. And then he goes in to look at, well, where does this idea come from? And one place it comes from is apparently Aristotle, who was quite dismissive of shepherds, said that they were the laziest. Yeah, he's always cropping up, yeah. He said that they were the laziest of people, that they get their subsistence from tame animals and they just wander around the place like he described it as sort of a living farm. And Croteau points out that few difficulties with this. First of all, Aristotle was not a Jew. He didn't live in Israel. His views on shepherding are really irrelevant to drawing any inferences about first century Judaism. And he lived more than 300 years before the birth of Christ. So somebody in a foreign country 300 years before the period we're talking about is not a reliable source for working out what the attitude would have been in that different country at that different time towards shepherds. There are also some other sources, and the main source that that is used for supporting this idea that shepherds are outcasts is the Babylonian Talmud. Now, the Babylonian Talmud is really a commentary on the Mishnah, and the Mishnah is a collection of rabbinic sayings. It was compiled, this is the Talmud, around AD 500, and it's rabbinic interpretations of the Old Testament and interpretations based on the Mishnah. But really, again, he says it's too late for it to be useful in helping us to understand what the understanding of shepherds was in a first century Israeli context. And Cruto says, sorry, I've just lost the place. I was unable to find even one source from first century Israel used to support the idea that shepherds were societal outcasts. So, and there's another site that I also found, which is, I'm going to mispronounce this, I'm sure, shabad.org, which is a Jewish site. And this talks about shepherds, and it's all like, oh, we Jewish people, we've always loved shepherds. We've always thought Jewish shepherds were fantastic. And it goes through how, you know, all the history of Moses and Abraham and David, they were all shepherds. And there's got a bit where it says, before medicine and law, it appears the honourable Jewish profession was animal herding. One could just imagine ancient parents proudly introducing their children as my son, the shepherd. So, again, you know, not really supportive of anyone who wants to say that shepherds were outcasts.
Yeah.
So those are the yeah. Sorry, what do you want to say?
Well, in context, it feels to me that Luke loves the underdog being inverted, with Mary being this poor country girl, and yet God's chosen her. Jesus was born in a placed in a manger because there's no room in the no guest room was available. It all is a piece of this humble, honourable humble. What's that Victorian term? The deserving
poor. The deserving poor. Yes. Yeah.
It's that flavour that seems to be there in Luke.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, but I thought to balance it, perhaps we should look at a very persistent myth that's gained traction amongst atheists.
Ooh.
And yeah, hard to believe, isn't it? Atheists do not always find the truth. You know, they can be wrong. And that is that there are any number of connections or similarities between the god Mithras and Jesus. And I think, I don't know if you'll be able to put this clip up, but we've got a clip of QI in which Stephen Fry is confidently listing all these supposed overlaps and similarities between the two. And we've got a couple of sites that are just tearing it apart. And one of them is Tim O'Neill, who writes the blog History for Atheists. Tim O'Neill is himself an atheist. And so it's rather sweet that we've got a Christian debunking a Christian myth about the nativity, but we can also find an atheist who's debunking an atheist myth about the nativity. And one of these persistent, I mean, there are a number of ways in which there are claims going around amongst atheists that Mithras and Jesus were terribly, terribly similar, and obviously Jesus was just like a development of the Mithraic mythology. But two of them that I'm going to focus on here was the claim that he was born of a virgin and that his birth was attended by shepherds. Well, he wasn't born of a virgin. He was supposedly born not as a baby, but as a fully formed adult male from stone. So I think Tim Neal comments, unless somebody can find a story in which Jesus is supposed to emerge from stone, fully formed as an adult male, there is really not an awful lot in common between these two. There's also an idea that his birth was attended by shepherds. And Tim O'Neill quotes somebody called Manfred Klaus, who says, there are no grounds for calling these two figures shepherds in the wake of the Christian nativity story. They are two people called, and again, I'm going to mispronounce that, Cautes and Cautopates, and they are depicted in the scenes showing Mithras being born out of a block of stone. And they are observing, sometimes helping him emerge from the rock. Cautes is usually depicted with his torch held upwards and Cautopates with his torch held down. So there's a theory that they represent sunrise and sunset, respectively. But there is just no reason to think that they are supposed to be shepherds. And bizarrely, I think this is sometimes claimed that it's supposed to have happened in a cave, and therefore that's another parallel with Jesus' story. Well, what's so bizarre is, quite apart from the fact there's no evidence that it did happen in a cave, Jesus being born in a cave isn't in any of the Christmas stories anyway. So it's sort of a non-existent parallel of something that doesn't even exist in the nativity story. So it's a complete fail. But there are other claimed parallels which are with Jesus, which are also dismantled in Tim O'Neill's blog, and he links to a couple of other blogs which also just tear it apart. So that's there we are.
I like it.
It goes to show that
I think the atheist fail,
everyone gets it wrong. Yeah, everyone gets it wrong sometimes, and everyone can be.
Sorry, the atheist fail I think is more spectacular than the David in Stone Brewer one.
Yes, I think it just doesn't have a leg to stand on, does it?
Yeah,
really?
Yeah. Andrew?
I was just taking it all in as like a rest from talking all about hell.
It's nice. It's nice bit of festive debunking.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's a fascinating.
We love a good
subject.
debunk, don't we?
Yeah, and it's something that I think we have touched on before, haven't we? But that was a thoroughgoing exposition of it all, I thought. So it was great that you got into that passionately, Francis. It must have been quite interesting.
Yes,
that research.
I mean, I think it's fun to see these ideas, and it's enjoyable when somebody approaches it and just really is able to back up their challenge to why this is wrong.
Well, it's time to wish you all Merry Christmas. But before we do, we like to ask or remind you about our doubtsaloud at gmail.com feedback. Talking of atheist theories and things, we had a lovely email from Peter Nothnagel, and he's encouraged us to look into mythicism, that would be great. And
mythicism being...
Well, the kind of headline of it is that Jesus never existed at all.
Yeah.
But I think we could take it more broadly around
the idea of legendary
what
things.
What can you
about
tell
Jesus.
is myth and what isn't? Yeah. So thank you, Peter, and we're going to pick you up on that.
We will indeed. And
that will be interesting.
And if there's anyone that wants to email in on the whole subject of hell and from their experience as a, say, non-Christian now, or maybe still a Christian, and their views, and also on the nativity stuff, welcome any emails in on that, anything we've said. So until next time, wish you all very Merry Christmas. And I've been Andrew, your host.
Yes, I've been Francis, and I'm wishing you all Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
and Merry Christmas to you all.